Hi everyone, this week we will be looking at Chapter 9, using standardized measurements to look at cognitive development. So when we think of the word or when we hear the word assessment, most often we think of a test. And that's because historically assessment is often or has often been used as a synonym for testing. Being in the field of early childhood, we know that historically we've used informal assessments in the form of naturalistic observations. So, in the early childhood field, we often think of assessment as getting to know students. Current recommendations indicate the need for assessment systems that are use ongoing, multiple methods for gathering information, which again brings us back to naturalistic observations. One of the reasons why you are asked or required to take an observation class when you are in a teaching credentialing program or a early childhood program is because, as this bullet point points out here, historically the field of early childhood relies heavily on naturalistic observations. Giving young children tests, it's usually not the best thing to do unless we are looking at delays or maybe we think that something else is going on with the child. So there's specific tests that we can provide or we can um, give to those students to get important information in order to better service them. But if the child is typically or developing typically, most often in the field of early childhood, we steer away from testing and we stick to naturalistic observations. Now, remember that assessment we can think of, it's just a way of getting to know students. So, giving a child a teacher created quiz or teacher created checklist, such as the ones we've created in this class, that's a type of assessment. But the kids are familiar with the adults in the classroom, they're familiar with the environment in the classroom, and we are not using those assessments to determine what grade those kids are going to be or what grade the child's going to get in the class. We're simply getting to know the children so that we can better service them, so we can come up with better curriculum, better lesson plans, better ideas to help our kids succeed or further develop the skills that they already have. Early childhood assessments involve a process of gathering data. Again, we have conducted many observations, and I've only introduced a handful. Once you go out in the field, or for those of you guys who are in the field, you know that there's a lot more observation methods that we can implement in our classroom. But the main purpose of those naturalistic observation is to better understand our students. It's to support their learning and development. And most importantly, or one of the most important things, is that it gives us information about what the child knows and what the child can do. If we know what the child is able to do and what that child knows, by providing these assessments or by conducting these observations, we are better equipped to help these children even develop further. Or if we know that one of our child or one of our students is having a difficult time writing, by assessing them, by observing them, we can figure out what level they're at and what we need to do to move them into a different level. So assessments need to be meaningful. Okay, we need to be intentional, and assessments need to be intentional in order for those assessments to truly give us the information that we need. So many times teachers conduct ASQs, DRDPs, ABC narratives, checklist, but it's just because it's part of the job per se, not necessarily because they take the results and implement them. If you are not being an intentional teacher and not conducting these observations or these assessments with the right um, intention, then they're not useful at all. And those assessments become irrelevant, not meaningful at all. So, if you are a teacher, it is very important that you are intentional and that you conduct these assessments and these observations intentionally so that those results and the data that you gather is meaningful and that you actually use it to help these children better further develop or improve their skills or just, become better at what they do. So, as you all know, there are many standards here in California. And if you are working in the field of early childhood, more than likely you are familiar with the California Preschool Learning Foundations. If you've never heard of these foundations or standards, if you have taken EAR 24, more than likely you are familiar with them. But if you're not, I would really recommend that you visit their website, and you can actually get these for free. You can download them PDFs, or you can order the actual books. I'm not sure if the actual books are free or not, but they're very inexpensive if they do cost, because it is from the California Foundation or the CDE. This picture on the screen is actually, it includes a live link, so you can click on it and it'll take you to the website. But I encourage you to become familiar with these standards, because it really helps us as teachers understand what children should be able to do. It just gives us a better idea of how to help them. Now, whether we like it or not, California and the whole United States is standards based. Okay. That's why the Common Core is where it is today. Um, the standards movement is it's very strong, and it began really in 2001. The standards define goals of practice, benchmarks, descriptions of knowledge, skills, and development that are measurable outcomes of standards. And as we are preparing our kids in preschool to enter elementary school, especially public school, they are going to go into an environment that is all standards based. So if we can help them already become familiar with that, or even the parents, it'll be a lot easier for our students, right? So the California Preschool Learning Foundations just gives us a lot of ideas, and it defines goals. How can we get our students to meet those goals? How can we get our students to meet those skills? And if we look at the DRDP, we've learned that it's correlated to the Preschool Learning Foundation. So everything is standards based. And the better we become familiar with all of these standards, the better our craft will become. Whether you really believe or agree with standards or not, the reality is that if you are teaching in a public setting here in California, you need to become familiar. Now, if you are teaching in a private facility or a private organization or a faith-based, they have different standards or measures that they look at, but a lot of them also include the Common Core. So it's just something that we really need to become familiar with. So if we look at this map, I just wanted to show you that the Common Core, if you guys all remember, um, the reason why the government decided that everyone should adopt the same standards was because some kids in some states were learning some things, kids in another state were learning something else, and the United States was just not that high as far as education levels when we were compared against other countries. So the Common Core came into effect with the No Child Left Behind as well, like in 2001. And all of the states in the country were encouraged to adopt the Common Core standard, so that everyone in third grade in California, everyone in third grade in Wyoming, everyone in third grade in Florida would all be learning the same material. And so the government just wanted uniformity. Okay. So as you can see here in 2011, only Texas was not part of the Common Core. They did not adopt it. And then the other two states, they had adopted part of it, but not the whole Common Core. And then all of the areas of the map that are green, they had completely adopted the Common Core. So that was in 2011. And then we moved forward to 2015, 2016. And look, now it seems like there has been a little more changes as far as how many states have decided to maybe steer away from the Common Core. So we are now a little less, right? Or 40, it says here, 43 states have completely adopted the Common Core. Now, standards is going to be something that we're all going to have different opinions on. But again, reality is that if you live in California and any of these other states who adopted Common Core, we have to become familiar with it. So, using standards and tests as a way of knowing. How is early childhood and Common Core, or the field of early childhood and Common Core, related? Well, I've already shared with you the California Learning Foundations, and the California Early Learning Foundations is actually very closely related to the TK and kindergarten Common Core standards. So we are preparing our kids to enter a field that heavily uses standards. So we need to become familiar, right? Again, our field historically uses naturalistic observations, and I completely agree. I completely agree that we should continue to do that and that we should rely a lot less on standards. But I don't think that the standards movement is going to go away anytime soon. So we need to prepare our kids socially and emotionally and all that, but we also need to prepare them to enter this world that is heavily standardized. So early learning standards should emphasize significant developmentally appropriate content and outcomes. So when we are developing lessons and activities and curriculum for our students, we need to be intentional. That doesn't mean that we can't play with them. That doesn't mean that that we can't have fun. It just means that everything that we do, even if it's fun, we need to be intentional and we need to know why we're doing it. Some people always say, "Oh, we implement creative curriculum." Well, guess what? Creative curriculum is one of my favorites. But if you're implementing creative curriculum because you think that there's really no planning that comes along with that, or that children just learn as they play, you're right in the sense that children will learn as they play, but you're incorrect if you say or if you believe that there's no planning. Even with creative curriculum, there's a lot of planning, and there should be goals and objectives. And if you are having your kids play with the color yellow in one day, you need to know why, what your goal is, and what your objective is. And it's okay to look at the California Learning Foundations to see what standards they have to make sure that you meet them. Be intentional. You can still have fun and be intentional at the same time. Early learning standards are developed and reviewed through informed, inclusive processes. So the early, it's not just something that someone just said, "Oh, here's a standard." And although some, critics of the standards do believe that, being in the field, only someone who has been in the field will understand that it is necessary to have goals and objectives. So whether you enjoy creative curriculum or high scope or whatever curriculum that you have or that you implement in your classroom, you still need to be familiar with standards. Early learning standards gain their effectiveness through implementation and assessment practices that support children's development in ethical and appropriate ways. Another thing that, we really need to be aware of when we are conducting assessments and when we are creating curriculum, that we are being ethical, that we are being age appropriate and developmentally appropriate. And sometimes having these standards help us better identify children who may not be developing age appropriately or maybe in atypical ways. So standards in that sense can also help us identify these children, and we are better able to help them and service them in comparison to if we didn't have or if we didn't implement any standards or any assessments, or if we don't conduct any observations. So again, naturalistic observations, which is a form of assessment, are really important, especially when dealing or when working with early childhood in the field of early childhood, because we have the privilege as early childhood teachers to quote unquote catch right? If there are any atypical behaviors or patterns in children, and we are with the data that we gather through our observations and assessments, we are able to refer them to specialists to be assessed, or maybe just speak to the parents and have the parents refer themselves or take them to a pediatrician. But part of the reason why standards help with that is because they do give us kind of like benchmarks that we can compare to. Okay. Early learning standards require a foundation of support for early childhood programs, professionals, and families. So, once again, if we I'm not saying that we should only rely on standards or that we should 100% heavily rely. Reality is that they are part of our field and we do need to be familiar with them. But I do believe that um, demonstrating or making social emotional curriculum or learning a priority in our classroom is important. And by doing so, that's another way that would allow us to identify, right, if any of our children may be developing typical behaviors, or if we see typical patterns and things like that. And by having and following these standards, we actually have support that is given to us or into our field and as parents and teachers so that we can better service these children. So, again, with the Common Core and with the standards, there has become, or we have become, or this world has become a world of test. The Head Start National Reporting System, back in 2003, they actually conducted the largest assessment of standardized assessment of 4-year olds. It was about 450,000 4-year olds that were assessed. And if you guys all know the history of Head Start, it began back in 1965. It's a federal program, it's federally funded, it's not state based. So that's why, for those of you guys who work in Head Start or who are familiar with Head Start, whether you were a student in Head Start or have students in Head Start, you know that Head Start is very strict, right? That, for a lack of a better word. Head Start provides a lot of services for their children, for their parents, for their teachers, but it also requires a lot. And part of the reason is because it's a federal program. And it was a federal program that was established to help kids close the gap, to help those kids who were living in poverty, give them a chance to catch up to to the kids who were the same age, right? So we know by research and experience and everything that if you are not feeling well, if you don't have a full belly, if you're not living in the best home, in the best situation, you're not going to have the right head, or you're not going to be level minded to go into school and learn. So there's a lot of gaps between those children who are undergoing a lot of stress at home and those kids who are not. So back in 1965, Head Start was developed to try to close that gap and help those kids who lived in poverty. So, they're like, man, we need to really test out if Head Start is really helping, if it's something that we should continue to use our money or funds for. So in 2003, they decided to conduct a big standardized testing. Again, it was about 450,000 4-year olds. And the test actually concluded that kids who participate in Head Start have a major growth or have a lot of vocabulary and math skills in comparison to other kids who do not attend Head Start. However, by the time they are entering second grade or at the end of first grade, that advantage or that knowledge that they had, high knowledge that they had in vocabulary and math, kind of catches up to their peers, which, I mean, I say unfortunately because you would think that that would continue to stay with them for the rest of the life. But at the same time, that was mainly what Head Start wanted. They just wanted to close that gap, and they just wanted the children who participate in Head Start, to be able to catch up to their peers. So that's a good thing. And now we are in 2025, 2020, and Head Start still going strong. And so let's see where it goes. We also know about No Child Left Behind back in 2001. Again, the federal government, where they're saying we're spending so much money on education, but are we really holding states accountable? That's when we started seeing a huge increase in charter schools, right? They were like, they were holding teachers accountable for their students' learning. And we know as teachers, for all of us who are in the field, that we can be the best teacher ever and we can try our hardest, but sometimes the kids are not ready to learn. Especially in early childhood, we need huge parental support, and sometimes we don't have that. Sometimes we don't have the material necessary, right? There's a lot of things. So imagine the teachers who are in primary, secondary schools. They, I'm sure, go through the same situations, right? And if you are a parent, sometimes I'm a parent, and sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I come home from work, I'm so tired, working more than 8 hours a day, more than 40 hours a week. And now I have to come home, cook, clean, all this stuff. So it is very difficult. So we are able to see both sides of the coin, right? But back in 2001, they were really only holding teachers in school districts and states accountable for the lack of appropriate education levels in our students. A lot of teachers were sent back to school to complete different credentials, to get different authorizations, and just basically to become better educators, right? But since then, instead of our education levels going up, they're actually going down. So one example is in 2000, the United States was 18th, was in the 18th place in math out of, you know, yeah, 18th place, which is not the best, but it was in 18th place. Well, now we look back in 2009, and the United States actually placed 31st place in math. So holding teachers accountable and doing all this, what the No Child Left Behind, it actually has not proven to make positive changes. So that's one of the, arguments that critics have. How do standards and how do tests really help? So that's just something that, we won't know, I guess, for until maybe another assessment. Again, critics of standardized tests on young children, we need to really be aware and really know the child. Is the child ready for a test? Can the child handle a test? Now, when we're thinking of little ones, especially in early childhood, we know that if children are not familiar with the test, or the person who is conducting the test, more than likely they're not going to be open and they're not going to be willing to test. Now, let me share an example. My daughter, I shared with you guys, she has an IEP for speech. And when she first began for the assessment, she just would not speak. She would not open up. And we had a very difficult time getting her assessed. But then I introduced her to an SLP at a different place, and she got to know the person before she conducted the assessment. She met her once or twice before the assessment, and then she did the assessment, and she was able to complete her assessment, and that's why she was able to receive her services. But little children, young children, and I'm sure even older, they just have a very difficult time opening up to strangers, because when we're looking at standardized assessments, it's usually people who have been trained to give this test. So it's not always necessarily the teacher that will be conducting the exams. If you are in a teaching credentialing program, or you are going to go to a teacher credentialing program, you will see the level or the test that teachers have to take in order to become credentialed in the state of California. It's intense. And there's special protocols, people who are specifically trained to give the test. They have all these little speeches memorized, and it's very uncomfortable, even as adults. So imagine young children having to go through this. And the test, is the test really necessary? Is it age appropriate? Is it developmentally appropriate? All of these things heavily impact the results that the test will have. And is the use of the test the correct one? Are they using the correct test for what they want to learn? If they are assessing a child for speech, why are they assessing them in their math skills? They shouldn't. They're specific tests for speech. If you are testing kids for cognitive delays, there are specific tests for cognitive delays. So I need to make sure that the child is ready, that the test is age appropriate and developmentally appropriate, and that the correct test is being given. Now, as I mentioned, more than likely, teachers do not conduct or administer standardized testing. But that doesn't mean that some teachers will not be trained to administer standardized testing. So if you are a teacher who is trained to provide or administer standardized tests, you need to make sure that you know child development stages and milestones so that you know whether or not this test is appropriate for the child or for the purpose that you are providing this test or giving this test. You need to be very familiar with the content of the test. You need to be familiar with the form. What form will you use for the children to answer, or will you answer for them? Will you ask a question and answer them, and the students will verbally give you the answer and you're going to write that down? Do you have a Scantron? Do the kids answer themselves? Do the parents, answer for the children? You need to know and become familiar with the validity of the test and standards. Are they, do they match the standards? And validity, do they match? Do they match the purpose of the assessment? Now, if you are giving a diagnostic test, now this one is really only administered by a qualified professional. Even if you are a trained teacher, a teacher who has been trained to provide or administer a standardized test, if it's for a diagnostic test, a teacher never gives this test. It's always administered by a qualified professional. So let's say you suspect or you believe that one of your students has a speech delay. You provide the SLP, the speech and language pathologist, with the information, with the data that you have gathered through your naturalistic observations. You give this information to the SLP. The SLP decides if she or he will come out to observe the child. Once they do come out and observe the child, then they decide if they will provide or administer a diagnostic test. But a teacher never gives a diagnostic test. It is always a qualified professional, in this case an SLP if it's for speech and language, okay? The child should never be forced to separate from their parents. If the child is not if it's having a difficult time or experiencing separation anxiety, the results are not going to be valid. So never separate the child or force the child to separate from the parents. The diagnostic test should consist of a wide range of criteria, a lot of questions and answers, a lot of different methods, right, or different content, not just one, not just all multiple choice, not just open-ended or ask and answer. It should include a lot of different content and forms and just consist of a wide range of criteria. And also, a diagnostic test should not carry more weight than a family testimony. So this was very important in my situation since my daughter wouldn't open up to the SLP. The SLP did not just say, well, she doesn't want to test. She seems like she's fine. We're just going to close the test and we're just going to not provide her with services because she doesn't need it. But she actually asked me a lot of questions. She had me fill out a lot of surveys, and I did so. And she took that information that my husband and I gave her, and our information weighed a lot more than the responses on the test. So that's what it means by saying that a diagnostic test should not carry more weight than a family testimony. Now, back to what to do if you are a teacher who needs to provide or administer a standardized test. If you have to administer a standardized test, make sure that you understand the purpose, or that you understand that the purpose should be to improve performance. Um, the test should be administered individually. It should be skill based rather than written or verbal. And I'm talking about early childhood. And you always want to be prepared. So do more preparation than necessary. If you're going to need pencils, how many pencils are you going to have ready to go? If you're going to need scrap paper, how much are you going to have ready to go? If you're going to need blocks, again, if you are, skill, if you should be skill based around the written or verbal. So what materials do you need? Have that all ready to go. Don't be wasting time or becoming unorganized or having the child become antsy because you're not prepared. Do more preparation than necessary. If you are allowed to use technology, find the right technology to use. And then also, what do you do with the results that you have or that you gather from the test? Remember back to what I said a few slides ago. Test and observations and assessments mean nothing, are meaningless if you don't do them intentionally, or if the results are not used for something that can help the children become better prepared or better or further their skills, right? So if you take an assessment and then you get the results and you just file them away in your file cabinet, it's not intentional, it's meaningless. There's nothing why did you waste the child's time, the family's time, your time on conducting this assessment? Make sure that you take the results and actually do something with them, follow through. So again, one of the reasons why so many people are against standardized assessments is because they're formal assessments and they are assessments specifically constructed according to a set of testing standards. Now, we all know that whether you're in the field of early childhood or any other grade, we are not all developing the same way. We all have different strengths and we all have different needs. And when we're looking at standardized assessments, it doesn't matter for those exams. Everyone takes the same exam regardless of what your strengths and weaknesses. One of the reasons why they went away with the California high school exit exam is because a lot of the kids weren't passing it. Now, there was a lot of kids who had learning delays or cognitive delays that had never been diagnosed. There was kids who came to the United States from other countries that maybe didn't speak, read, and write at the level that the test needed them to read, write, and speak, right? So it doesn't matter your strengths and your weaknesses. If you're taking a standardized assessment, you are being tested in the same way as anyone else. Back to becoming a teacher. All of the assessments to become a teacher are standardized. So if you didn't go to school here your whole life, or if you didn't go to a high school where they had the highest programs or the highest scores or the highest teachers or classes or whatever you want to call, you might struggle a little bit more. Also, there's some people who are just not good test takers, right? Ask me to write an essay. I'll write you an essay in a heartbeat. To give me a topic and I'll give you 2-3 pages in 10 minutes. But if you give me a test, I'm not going to be the best at it, which is another reason why people don't like standardized assessments and people believe that standardized assessments are not fair. Standardized means to apply the same measure in the same way to determine an individual result compared to an expected response. Everyone who takes the same standardized assessment is given the same instructions, the same materials, the same test times. There's a trained facilitator, trained facility. Okay, so what if you have a special need? Well, it doesn't matter if you're taking a standardized test. If you're taking a standardized test, no individuality, things like that are taken into account. Unless you are a person who has been diagnosed with a special need or learning disability, then obviously students who have those diagnoses would probably not be taking standardized assessments. So back to the California exit exam. Anyone who was not a special education student was given the same amount of time, the same instructions, the same materials to take the California exit exam. And I believe all students were given 5 chances to pass the exam. But if you were a student in a special education program, you were given more opportunities to pass the exam, and you were also given, I believe, tools like dictionaries and things like that to pass the exam, but they had to be allowed or outlined by the student's IEP. So you see how why a lot of people don't believe the standardized assessments are the best thing. Now, this is a perfect example or something that really helped me understand. You see, there's elephants, monkeys, birds, snake, a seal, a dog, and a fish in a fishbowl. And then here's the test administrator, the person who has been trained to give this test. And he says, for a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Well, we already know that the monkey, the snake, is going to have the advantage on this, right? Should the elephant even try? The fish in the bowl? The penguin, the seal? And that's a really good example or a good visual of what a standardized test is. A standardized test is given the same way to every person who takes the exam, regardless of strengths and regardless of abilities. So another standardized or some other standardized assessments are screening assessments. Now, these are all standardized, but in this case, we want them to be standardized, okay? Because the ultimate purpose of the screening assessment is to efficiently identify those children who need more thorough and detailed assessment. So we did the ASQ. You're familiar with them. The first thing you did was go onto the ASQ calculator. You inputted the child's date, and it gave you the exact month or the exact form that you had to use, right? So if you have 12 children and they all have to take the 48-month-old assessment, and you notice that they're all about, the same level, but then you see some children who scored in the black or scored in the gray. That ASQ helped you identify those children, and now you can decide what you're going to do. Remember the follow-up. Are you going to conduct more observations? Are you going to provide more activities? Are you going to refer to an SLP? Are you going to refer to a pediatrician? So a screening assessment, although it's standardized, it helps you efficiently identify those children who need more thorough and detailed assessment. Screening assessments are also short and easy to administer. They should include multiple sources of information, and they're standardized and require parental involvement. So remember, in the ASQ, there was a lot of yes, maybe, sometimes, and then there was an open-ended questioning area. And then obviously the parents can complete the ASQ, and the teachers could too. So that's how you provide parental involvement or require parental involvement. You can also ask parents to complete a parent survey or just have a parent-teacher conference and talk to them about what you found. Some screening instruments that you might come across when working in the early childhood field, all the way up to first grade, you will see the ASQ, the DIBELS, which is something very popular in all the elementary schools. It's a phonics early reading and writing and reading instrument or assessment. Our preschool programs in RUSD give the DIBELS. So we have the ASQ, we have DIBELS, and if you click on the DIBEL picture here, it's actually a live link, and it'll take you to the website if you wanted to look at this form a little bit more. Now, remember, a lot of these assessments are not free. The districts or the companies have to pay for them. So it's very difficult sometimes to find a lot of information about the assessments. We also have the early screening inventory and the Battelle developmental inventory screening test. So these four are examples of screening instruments. Another type of assessment or that can be standardized is the instructional assessment. And the ultimate goal of these instructional assessment is to inform, support, and monitor learning. Instructional assessments are meant to support early learning and development. They provide information about what students can do and know. And they also help to develop goals for like the IEPs, the individualized education plans, the Head Start individualized learning plans, ILPS, and the IFSPs, the individualized family services plans. So when you have screening assessments and you have instructional assessments, they just give you a lot of data that you can use in order to develop appropriate goals, especially when we're working with kids who have special needs, kids who have an individualized education plan, an IEP. You need to have goals and you need to help these children reach these goals. So by conducting ongoing assessments, observations, you're better able and equipped to help them out. So again, these instructional assessments sometimes are standardized. Instructional assessments are used frequently and continuously. They are most accurate when multiple sources are used. They are criterion reference, which again, it means that I put the little picture here. Criterion reference test compare a student's knowledge and skills against a predetermined standard cut score or other criterion. So you kind of like the checklist that we created, right? We set up or we developed a checklist, and then we go out there and see where the children are at according to our checklist. The instructional assessments should reflect a logical teaching sequence. So let's say, for example, you are giving an instructional assessment for your preschoolers, and it's the beginning of the year. You have not started introducing sight words, and you start assessing their sight word knowledge. Well, probably that's probably not best practice, and it's not reflecting logical teaching sequence. Now, if you have been introducing the ABC and you provide or you give a checklist on ABC knowledge, then that's more logical, and that follows or reflects a logical teaching sequence. Again, the results of these instructional assessments should be used to create curriculum, activities, and develop goals to help the students succeed. If you are conducting screening assessments, standardized assessments, instructional assessments, and you're not doing anything with the results, there's no point. Don't waste your time. Really, don't waste your time. Some examples of instructional assessments are observations, as we know, children's work, right? Like the little example that I have here. You can take the children's work and you can see what letters they're forming, how many body parts they're putting on their little drawings, if they're writing their names, if they're writing dates, if they understand colors, if sequences, if they can tell you stories, language, literacy development, so much that you can tell from a piece of artwork. And it's children's work, it's observation, and you can definitely use it for the ASQ and the DRDP and for any other assessment that you might be incorporating into your program. But most importantly, if you see that this little girl's name is Mary and she has the MA down, but maybe not the whole name and not in order, you can say, you know what? I see that she's almost there. I'm going to make sure I develop activities and provide the opportunities for her to practice writing her name so that in a week or two, she correctly and completely writes her name. So that's what you do when you take information from these type of observations on children's work. You can also do a direct assessment like the DIBELS that we mentioned earlier, okay? And HighScope. HighScope is Head Start. HighScope Head Start uses high scope curriculum, and high scope also has an assessment portion of it. And again, as I mentioned, many of them are not free. The programs and organizations have to buy licenses and to provide the actual assessment. So it's very difficult to find out a lot of information about them. But if you wanted to, you could go into the high scope and find out more. But it's basically observation related. They rely a lot on children's work and observations in order to effectively assess the children and the program. And then you also have the work sampling system, usually early childhood, and they collect sample work like the one you see on your screen, and it just helps teachers identify the levels or the which levels the children are at and what levels they need to move onto and how they can move them. And then the DRDP, which pretty much can be completed by using observations, children's work, and direct assessments. So all of these are examples of instructional assessments that you can implement into your classroom. Now, the diagnostic assessments. These are assessments that are given by professionals. Okay, it is not a teacher that is providing or implementing these assessments. It is always a professional. Diagnostic assessments are comprehensive procedures that address specific questions about the development, knowledge, and skills of young children. The results are designed to describe a developmental or academic problem with precision. The purpose of diagnostic assessments is to identify and secure appropriate intervention services for children whose development and or learning are delayed. These assessments are relatively expensive and time-consuming. Okay, when a child is being assessed in order to identify a delay, it's not just a 1 day or 1 hour thing. It's usually weeks, sometimes even months, different times and different people. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of school districts steer away from trying to assess students. So if you are a parent or if you are a teacher, you have to become an advocate for your student, and you have to really push. Because if it's up to these people, because as you see here, they're relatively expensive and time consuming, they will let it go. And everything has to be done in timelines. And if timelines are not kept up, then the process has to start all over again. So as a teacher, as an intentional and responsible teacher, you have to be aware of dates, and you have to be aware of what's going on, so that and you basically become an advocate for your student to make sure that you secure this appropriate intervention services, whether it's speech or autism or ADD or dyslexia or whatever it may be. As a teacher, it is your responsibility to make sure that your children get assessed if you feel and if you see that they need that assessment. Diagnostic assessments are reserved for students who do not demonstrate typical development as identified by screening assessments, okay? So best practice would be to conduct screening assessment, maybe 1 or 2. After that, naturalistic observations, a few, maybe a week or 2 weeks of naturalistic observations. And then instructional assessments, 1, 2, 3, as many as you can. Provide enough data, enough evidence to these specialists so that they don't question you. By providing all this evidence to these specialists, you are helping this child secure appropriate intervention services. And that's our job. Again, as early childhood professionals, we have the privilege to catch, quote unquote, when one of our children is not developing typically. Diagnostic assessments are always standardized. They should always be standardized, because when you give a child the same exam, that any child the same age will take, you can really identify how well or how not so well the child did. And that will obviously help this child secure the services. The diagnostic assessments are very specific. Diagnostic assessments should always be used to include students, never to exclude. Diagnostics assessments should be limited. Just be not, you have a class of 16 kids, you're not going to have all your kids assessed. No, you're going to leave this assessments to for those children who you really think need them or could benefit from these. And these assessments should only be used for intended services. Now, diagnostic assessments are usually approved by the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act. And just so you guys know, any child who is 3 years old or older, by law, is guaranteed a free and appropriate assessment by their local public school district if you believe that there is a need for this child to be assessed. Even if the child is not enrolled in school, but if you can prove that this child lives in the service area of this public school district, you can go to the elementary school office and ask and request for an assessment, and they cannot deny it. Just so you know. And that's part of the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act law. Some examples of diagnostic assessments are the Assessment, Evaluation, and Programming System, Second Edition, AAPS. Again, these are all standardized and very expensive. So I can give you the names, but I can't give you that much information. The Battelle Developmental Inventory, the Bailey Scales of Infant Development, and Peabody Developmental Motor Scales. And these are only a handful. There are many, 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 many. There are many examples and many assessments that are used. Another type of standardized assessment is Program Evaluation and Accountability Assessment. Now, they both involve systematic procedures to describe services and measure outcomes for groups of young children and their family. They are similar, but they are not the same. Evaluation is conducted to support program quality improvement. How's the program going? How's it going? Should we do something to change it up? Is it meeting the goals and objectives? Is it really doing, are the teachers and the program really doing what they're supposed to be doing? And then accountability, looking at products or results again. Now, if you are a charter school and all your kids should be reading at, all your kids in third grade should be reading at third grade level, they're going to be tested. And if they are, then great. But if they're not, then someone's going to have to be accountable. So that's the difference between evaluation and accountability. Both evaluation and accountability assessments answer formative questions about the overall quality of program accomplished through careful descriptions of service components and resources. Both are conducted to support program quality improvement. And most programs that have evaluation and accountability assessments is because they are required by public funding agencies. So if you work for a state-funded, county-funded, federally funded program, more than likely you are working in a program who requires a lot of evaluation and accountability assessments. Some of these examples of evaluation accountability are CLASS, which we've covered. ECHRS, we've covered. ITERS is the infant and toddler version of ECHRS. And then we have the early childhood classroom observation methods, early language and literacy classroom observation. And again, a lot of these are very expensive, so we don't have access to. The top two words, qualitative and quantitative, we all know what that means. Qualitative, kind of like products, just questions that are answered and we respond. So like ECHRS, you do a checkoff, but then at the end, they do an interview. So that's qualitative, right? And then you have quantitative, which would be your checklist based on points. Is everything met? So most program evaluation and accountability have both qualitative and quantitative formats. So Recap. Recap of standardized assessments or standards, right? Both. The advantages, they are fair, objective assessments of a child's capability. Now, that's what the book says, but not necessarily what we might believe, right? Another advantage is that it's recognized tests and scores used by intervention professionals. That's true. Used with other forms of information about the child to contribute to an overall picture of the child. Yes, diagnostic assessment specifically. Disadvantages. Children feel pressure during testing, and not just children, many of us, right? Norms may not match the child's cultural and socioeconomic circumstances. Again, the SATs, California Teaching Credentialing Testing, California Exit Exam, and so many other exams, sometimes they may not match the tester's cultural and socioeconomic circumstances. Young children's performance assessment is affected by the child's lack of experience with testing protocol, or maybe even just the person that's giving the test. They are used to making decisions about the child. They are used to make decisions about the child based on a false reading. Sometimes, yes. I've had a few instances where some of my children, or only two of many children, have not qualified for special services because they didn't speak English or English wasn't their first language, and the exam that they needed to take was only given in English. So the test giver or the examiner at that time decided that they didn't qualify for those services. So it's very frustrating. Test results punish economically disadvantaged children and children whose first language is not English. So due to this, many schools or many states or all states have gotten away with, or California has gone away from using the California exit exam. I know a lot of universities currently, I believe it was announced in June, they will no longer be using the SAT scores as a form of entrance. So there's a lot of things that, there's some advantages, but mostly disadvantages when it comes to standardized testing. The one benefit that I can say that I really see in standardized assessment is the diagnostic testing. When children are being assessed for special needs, even then, I don't always agree with the results, but most often they do provide resources and services for these children. So that's the one thing about standardized assessment. Okay, so that's the information I have for standardized assessment and some standard information. The rest of the chapter has to do with cognitive development and how you can look at cognitive development in the classroom when children are playing in different areas of the classroom. So I am going to allow you to go over that on your own, because that's all of the information that we have been going over the whole semester, and also information that you have learned in a lot of your other classes. Okay, everyone, I hope you guys all have a great week. Again, this was chapter 9, using standardized measurements to look at cognitive development. I wish you guys all a great week, and I apologize for the extra background noise, but as you all know, I am a mother of 2 little ones, so sometimes it gets a little chaotic in here, but thanks for your understanding, and we're almost done with the semester. Keep it up. We're almost done. Have a great week. Bye-bye.